and kind of a, I'm not going to say deep learning, a neural network approach, and sort of a general architecture or framework to thinking about dimensionality reduction and what we can learn by reducing our data. So the big idea is that data that we observe in the world is often in some complicated high-dimensional space, and we don't know what the geometry or structure of that space looks like, or even sometimes exactly what the dimensionality of that space looks like. But we're going to take our data, we're going to learn some low-dimensional representation of the data, and for the techniques that I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to take that low-dimensional representation and we're going to recreate our high-dimensional representation. And somehow, by performing this operation of taking our original data, doing something to it, and reconstructing the data set that we started with, somehow we will hope to learn something about our data. I'll also mention this is adapted from a tutorial that was given at a Fermilab high energy physics data science school. Okay, so we're going to start with talking about what is a representation in machine learning. So what is representation learning? What is the connection between representation learning and data visualization? We'll go into a specific example, which is autoencoders. So I'll talk about autoencoder architectures and this jargon of a latent space representation. And then we'll transition into talking specifically about variational autoencoders, which are a probabilistic kind of generalization of an autoencoder. And that's what I'll have you working with, is actually training a variational autoencoder on a large, well, not super large, but about 8,000 Hubble Space Telescope images. Okay, so we'll start with this question of what is a representation? Why do representation? So I sort of alluded to this already, but the idea here is we start with data in some high-dimensional space, but we suppose as our hypothesis that the data that we're observing in some high-dimensional space is not the kind of true dimension of the problem. So as an example, we could say galaxy colors, maybe 6 bands, so data that exists in R6, so 6 bands observed by LSST, or pick your favorite facility. We suppose that actually some lower dimensional space is responsible for generating those colors. And we want to learn something about that low dimensional space. So data is generated in a low dimensional space. It's mapped into a high dimensional space that we observe. And the idea behind representation learning is that we're going to go back to this low dimensional space. So this is, I'll mention that this is something that we should all care about a lot as scientists, right? So if you're, not to knock industry people, but if you're in industry and you're building a cat classifier, you maybe just care that you classify cats. You don't care that catness is somehow related to some low dimensional representation. As scientists, this low dimensional representation is telling us what we want to know about the structure of our data. So this is potentially very useful, specifically for scientists and astronomers. So as a recap, as I said, supervised learning is I give my model a bunch of different pictures that are labeled, and it says, okay, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is not a cat, this is a dog. And maybe if our algorithm is very sophisticated, maybe it can say, I actually don't know what that is. That's something else, right? And so that might be a way that we try and learn something about the world, is by picking out these very weird things. In the unsupervised learning context, maybe this problem looks a little bit different. Maybe I give my algorithm a bunch of different pictures without any labels, and I say, tell me what's the same with them. And maybe it picks out that actually this weird thing and this thing are very similar because they've got the same color, right? So maybe this is a group, right? Maybe these are a group, maybe this guy and these two are a group, something like that. So that's unsupervised learning. Oh, that was a transition that worked backwards. So representation learning is sort of a secret third thing. So we're going to start with a collection of images or a collection of other data. And what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to map to some low dimensional representation. So you could say all of these images are really captured by maybe the shape of the eye or the shape of the ear, something like that, right? And so if I knew what the data looked like in a low dimensional space of eye shapedness and ear shapedness, maybe I could reconstruct my full data set of images. I want to caution that this is an ambitious, this is a goal, right? Algorithms that we actually have don't quite achieve this, right? So when you're interpreting a representation that you've learned, you have to be really careful not to over-interpret. You're not guaranteed to get kind of a nice space that is really eerness and highness. But conceptually, this is kind of the goal of what we want to try and do. So as Adam said, we talked about this, another representation learning technique at the ML session. So these are self-organizing maps. So the idea here is to take photometric colors, project them down so that every cell in these maps is a different combination of photometric colors. And then I can do clustering basically on this space. I can color the cells by things I'm interested in, like redshifts, star formation rate, whatever it is, right? So this technique of self-organizing maps is very common for the design of surveys, where we're going to go, say, do spectroscopy because we're interested in whatever the values are here, for instance. But yeah, so I also wanted to mention here, so these kinds of plots where I have a two-dimensional representation of a high-dimensional space, these are called the latent space. These are the space that is generating the data that we're going to try and look at. Okay, so I just gave a specific example, a self-organizing map, something we've seen before. I'm going to give another specific example, which is called an autoencoder. So let's talk about what autoencoders are. So I took this from a nice review paper on autoencoders, but basically an autoencoder is an algorithm that generates some informative representation of the data that can be used for different applications, but one of the main ones is by reconstructing a data set while it has, right? So on my title slide, I had this, we have our data in some high dimensional space. We're going to learn some low dimensional representation, and we're going to reconstruct the high dimensional data. So that's what an autoencoder does. So the reconstruction part is the auto, and the representation part is the encoder. And one thing is that an autoencoder is a kind of general framework for performing this. You can do a lot of different, you can make a lot of different choices in the implementation of your autoencoder. So an autoencoder isn't a specific, it always looks like this with this many layers and this sort of thing. You have to make a lot of choices as you're building your autoencoder or your variational autoencoder to implement that. And so you could actually use different, we're going to use neural networks, but you can use a lot of different kinds of architectures to achieve this task in principle. Okay, so autoencoders are approximations to the identity function, right? So what we're learning is we're starting with our data, we're going to apply an identity function, and we're going to get our data back. And what the autoencoder is going to learn how to do is we're going to define a structure for our approximation to the identity function, but that's what we're learning. We're learning how to multiply our data by 1 and recover it. So given a data set, we want to learn the function x prime equals f of x that yields x equals x prime. So a good choice for this, as I said, is a neural network, because a neural network is a universal function approximator. So whatever this function is, a neural network should be able to learn it in principle. Basically, if a neural network can't learn to multiply by 1, there are problems. When we build our neural network architecture, we're basically encoding some additional degrees of freedom that we hope will yield some sort of representative or interpretable compression of the data, which is what the latent space is going to be. Okay, so some schematics. So say I'm looking at a set of images of handwritten digits. That's my input. I'm going to have something that I call an encoder. It's going to give me a latent space. And then I'm going to define something called a decoder that's going to take this latent space and give me the image back. And again, there's lots of different choices that you can implement for what the encoder looks like and what the decoder looks like. But this is the overall conceptual framework that you want to sort of plug into. This is a lot of text. I'm going to go ahead and skip this, other than saying this is assuming that you have kind of a neural network architecture. It's just another diagram. Or I guess I should say one more thing. So this latent space, you're going to have it be a much lower dimension than the dimensionality of your data. So the network will learn to compress into this low dimensional space. That's sort of the other point here. Okay. So let's talk about variational autoencoders. So the idea here is that we like probability, so we're going to make everything probabilistic. And the other thing, and I'm going to talk less about this session, but in a future session, one of the problems is that we're going to run into is that our posteriors are potentially intractable. So we're not going to know how to sample from them. And this is bad. So we're going to use some approximations to solve this problem. So the idea here is that I want to estimate the distribution relative to some parameters, say I have a neural network, of my data conditioned on my latent space. And basically that can just be factored that way into a conditional distribution and some distribution on the latent space. You can kind of think about that like a prior. So graphically, what I'm doing when I'm decoding is I'm taking a latent space vector, I'm computing some probability that my data point came from that latent space vector, and the decoder is going to take this probability and turn it into the original data. This has a name in other contexts. This is a generative model. So a variational autoencoder is not an example of a generative model, but it uses a generative model to perform the task that we want it to do. And we're going to make a strong assumption, at least for today, that the distribution of the latent space is a normal distribution. So we can add that to our sort of graphical representation. So we take our data, make some assumption that this latent space has vectors that are normally distributed, and then those get decoded back in the original data. So something I don't think I made very clear in this set of slides, but is really important, is that when we're doing machine learning, we always have some loss function. We're always trying to optimize our ability to sort of reconstruct the data, right? So the loss function has two terms. One term is going to be basically how different the output images are, in our case, compared to the input images. So we'll run this network, we'll compute the difference between the two, and that's how we'll train the model to learn the parameters of each of these layers. I'm not going to get into this too much, but we will talk about this in the next, or in the statistics session, which will probably be the next session. But there's going to be another term that's related to trying to force the latent space to have a normal distribution. So this is basically a measure of how these different distributions differ from each other. You can think about this like a regularization term. As I mentioned, things get complicated numerically. And so there are sort of two tricks. One is called the elbow. We'll talk about this. And one is called the reparameterization trick. Because these words come up a lot when talking about variational autoencoders, I wanted to give you this slide, make you aware of what they are. And I'll provide some other resources where if you need to know more of the details, you can read about that. But since our focus today is on visualization, I'm going to skip the details of these two tricks. But they're very important to the actual construction of a variational autoencoder. Okay, so an example. So we take our handwritten data set, and we're going to try and learn some latent space representations. So there are two here. So this is a uniform sampling of our latent space. And so this is just a sampling. So we're not looking at all of the latent space vectors, but you can sort of look at the structure of these vectors are what generates the large data set of these handwritten digits. And then the other sampling here is using our knowledge of the latent space being Gaussianly distributed. So this is sampling, accounting for the probability of a vector being at a certain point in the latent space. So these are two different kind of visualizations of the latent space that you can maybe abstract some meaning from, right? And again, as you're thinking about abstracting meaning in the structure of the latent space, you should be really careful, right? The latent space is a thing that you've sort of constructed, and the dimensions don't necessarily have physical significance, although you might be able to learn something about the structure of the data from latent space. As another example, so we're not going to do this for the Hubble Space Telescope images, but what you can do is you can also look at the latent space. So this is the latent space that you learn on the digit data set. and you can color regions by the digits that each region corresponds to. So for instance, this cluster down here, all of these points in the latent space are generating digits that are classified as 1. Yeah.
Is that what you call a hyperparameter?
So a hyperparameter is going to be a parameter that you set in like constructing the model. They're kind of like a prior that you encode in the model architecture. These axes are going to be some combination basically of input features. Does that make sense? So the intuition here goes back to there. Oops. So the intuition goes back to here. So in a self-organizing map, which is just another way of learning a latent space, these axes, so the numbers don't mean anything, they're just indexes. But every point in this latent space is some linear combination of features in the original data set. So that's the same thing here. So each point here is basically a combination of features in the original data set. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess until you just said to not read too much into what the latent space looks like, I was thinking that we were doing this in order to use the latent space to like learn something about the representation.
Yeah, you are. I'm just trying to make sure that you're very careful doing it.
So what should we do? And maybe this will just be for parent example.
So, I mean, so that's kind of the intent of this example here, right? So you want to be really careful, and it's an open research question as to how to interpret latent spaces, right? So I want to be careful about what I say, given that it's an open research question. Some people really don't like the idea that you can interpret the latent space, but you can do other things in the latent space to understand its structure. So one very common use case for this is to do outlier detection. So the idea is that even in an unsupervised setting where you don't know the values of things, if there's a point like this point and this point probably represent data that has a different structure. So points that are far away from each other. So you can make those kinds of interpretive statements, right? But you should be careful about saying like, this axis means, oneness, right? And 7 has more oneness than 8. I don't know, right? Like you should be careful about making those statements. But that is, we ultimately want to understand the structure. That's what we are trying to do as scientists, right? So, but you're always looking kind of the geometry of this space. And that's what the clustering is doing. It's saying all of the 1s are clustered here, all of the 7s are clustered here. So when you have labeled data, this is not as difficult. For the example I've given you, we don't have labels for this. So you're not going to be able to do this, but you'll still be able to generate visualizations, right? These are new examples. These are new examples the model has learned how to make based on vectors in the latent space. And so you're going to generate new examples and look at their kind of distribution. Okay, yeah, so that's what this slide says. So there are some instructions in the Slack. You should be a little careful because it's a large data file that we've compressed. So there's about 8,000 images, and Google Drive and Colab should work together, but they sometimes don't. So be sure to follow the instructions very closely. Again, the machine learning part is really just so you can see how you set this kind of thing up. You shouldn't spend too much time on setting up the machine learning. Make sure you understand what it does, but just read through it and focus on the visualization task for the rest of the time. Okay, that's all I have. So I will be around to answer questions. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Toby.